Hi everyone, please support our videos on Patreon. The link's at the end of the video and in the down there part. Thank you, you're lovely. Over the years, there has been a lot of criticism directed at She-Ra and the Princesses of Power for the way it handles its main romance, and rightfully so. It was the distillation of the worst romance tropes that online fandom culture had allowed to ferment for 20 years in its own version of porn escalation, resulting in the logical conclusion of a story where you can brutalize, mind control, emotionally torment, and violate someone, and still be considered worthy of their affections because fandom culture and things incels believe have been getting more and more unified as the years go on. The entire romance arc can be summed up with this Seinfeld clip.
Why? Why do guys do this? What is so appealing to men about a cat fight?
Yeah, cat fight.
Because men think if women are grabbing and clawing at each other, there's a chance they might somehow kiss.
But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about something else that has popped up in my comment section more than once that I find troubling. Okay, so a little background. There's a notion among S-Pop's fanbase that Nate Stevenson used the relationship between Adora and Catra as a proxy representation for his own relationship between him and his wife Molly Ostertag, with himself as Catra and Molly as Adora. Allegedly, he said this himself in an interview, but given that the creators of adventure fantasy shows that take way too much inspiration from bad anime tend to do about 25 interviews a week, it's hard to track down exactly which one it is. But its validity is irrelevant, because everything I say here applies regardless of whether it's true or not. Because in the aftermath of my last video, and a few others talking about the sheer amount of romanticized violence in She-Ra, people have been digging up this quote to imply that because Nate identifies so much with Catra, that means he must also beat his wife relentlessly. And that's a notion I want to stamp out with extreme prejudice. See, when you put that much of yourself into a work, you make yourself vulnerable. And it's indeed very easy for bad actors to rip those works apart specifically for being vulnerable. And it's easy to follow that through line to everything else. Nate recently had a bit of a coming out where he all but confessed that he has a very complicated relationship with gender, and that's reflected in the way Double Trouble is, well, they're very clearly written by someone who has a complicated relationship with gender. But the big one is Catra. Nate allegedly poured a lot of himself into Catra, and that is, be nice, Lily. Interesting. One element of Catra that is explored somewhat but not talked about very much is the fact that Catra herself is a victim of abuse from Shadow Weaver. It's not talked about very much because the romance took all the attention and Catra's behavior was elevated alongside it. But when you add this in here, you now have a story about an abuse victim becoming an abuser herself. A narrative that is, boy, am I sick of this fucking trope. It's a narrative that demonizes abuse victims and uplifts their abusers, especially given that both Shadow Weaver and Hordak both get redemption arcs, which is... Why would you do 3 redemption arcs in one show? Whatever, we're getting off topic. Now, whenever this is brought up, somebody will inevitably bring up the fact that the cycle of abuse is a thing, that it happens in real life. And yes, it does, but it also doesn't. It's often declared reasonably common for abusers to become abusive people themselves, but in reality, only about 30% of abuse victims become abusers. And for those of you who are irony poisoned by YouTube dislikes, 30% is not a lot. Most people who are abused do not become abusers. The vast majority, in fact. Furthermore, the cycle of abuse does not refer to a cycle of victims becoming abusers. It actually refers to a cycle where abusive behavior perpetuates itself, where abusers will use apologies and honeymoon periods to normalize the idea in their victims that this is just a part of their lives. Furthermore, they will often make excuses, blame the other person, and then deny it ever happened to further that cycle along before the tensions rise, communication halts, and you're telling people that you walked into a door. No, really, stop looking at me like that. This is why abusers tend to rip apart their victims' friendships, because without an outside perspective looking in, this all seems normal. This is why shows like Steven Universe are so terrible, because they are an outside source openly perpetuating this very cycle by their themes being the reconciliation phase. And it's why victim blaming from third parties is such ghoulish behavior. There is nothing an abuser loves more than victim blaming narratives. This is why the deluge of victims becoming abuser stories are such a dangerous narrative to so consistently push, because it does nothing but serve abusers. Furthermore, when victims devolve into abusive behavior themselves, it's often a very complicated situation. Victims who escape are on edge, they're emotionally raw, their feelings are all over the place, they have trained reflexes that openly resist anything that might look like another raised fist. As a result, they have a tendency to lash out at others. But this lashing is often impulsive and immediately retracted. In pop culture, it's treated like it looks like this.
I told you not to come back!
but you just love feeling like a hero, don't you? You'd rather I left you there to die? What do you care? I know you all hate me!
But in reality, it looks closer to this.
What do you know about it? Nothing!
I'm sorry, son. I don't know why I said that.
Furthermore, this tends to only be the case for a few years at most. If you're going to therapy and taking your medicine and working toward recovery, this won't be your status quo for very long. At most, this is a difficult 2 years of your life as you learn to trust and rely on people again. But you will still get folded into that 30% statistic, which is fucking horrible. That is obscenely reductive and actively fucking cruel. But stories about victims becoming abusers are never that nuanced. Maybe Lisa the Painful, if even that, but most stories about this particular topic are never that complicated or well thought out, because abused becomes abuser is the entry-level concept that every single fucking hack writer thinks they're the first person to think of, and it never becomes more complex than,
and with each selfish act became you.
Some people think they're so fucking smart for writing this shit. And it's because of shit like this that real-life abuse victims have a genuine and crippling fear that their abuse has tainted them in some way, and that they need to seek forgiveness for not being okay, because our culture constantly hammers it into our fucking heads that despite escaping, we will never truly escape. That seeking justice or closure will only make you vindictive and just like them. If you're not seeing the way this deliberately sets up abuse victims to fail, then I can only conclude that you are malicious. Many abuse victims believe this horseshit that our culture forces onto them to preserve its precious status quo. And this is what brings us back to Catra, because if the rumor is to be believed and the notion that Catra needs to forgive herself for the crime of being abused and groomed, then it's reasonable to believe that Nate possibly believes this about himself, even if it's not actually true. That Nate has been immersed in fandom and weeb culture that practically idolizes the abuse victim to evil sexy mommy romance pipeline doesn't help either. Fandom culture fetishizes abuse victims who lash out because it's their preferred variation of I can fix her, or the even more ghoulish I can make her worse. For as much as lesbians might love Sylvanas Windrunner, a lot of them only like her because her status as an abuse victim with questionable ethics is their way to get the hot evil bitch with the soft gooey center trope they fetishize so much. 90% of the Sylvanas Jaina pairing is just people projecting onto Jaina because they're too chicken shit to write the Sylvanas Alliance champion story we all know they want to write. And this is not a healthy environment for an abuse victim to be in. So when you have a creator talking about how much he identifies with Catra and use Catra's story of forgiveness as a vector for his own, there is a disconnect between how much of it is relevant to that person's actual life. It's worth pointing out that Nate is married, and someone who behaves like Catra does to Adora would never be married. I know fandom is completely irony poisoned and hasn't spoken to another human being since the 90s anime boom, but if you treated someone in real life the way Catra treats Adora, you wouldn't end up in a relationship with them unless they were 13 and their only experience with relationships is shit like this and, I don't know, killing, stalking, Beauty and the Beast. A victim has to be conditioned pretty damn hard to put up with shit like this, and it's always a crapshoot. It's only in fictional stories where a creator has total control over what the characters do and say, where the victim would tolerate any of this crap. In reality, you wouldn't be someone's girlfriend after pulling half the shit Catra does, you'd be someone's prison wife. I think the fact that Nate isn't tweeting from prison is a pretty good barometer that he's not as much like Catra as he apparently thinks he is. And when I pointed this out in the past, people will say that Nate uses Catra's arc of forgiveness as a means of forgiving himself. But guys, people believe stupid shit about themselves all the fucking time. My wife seems to think that she's a burden when she asserts basic boundaries like, I'm not comfortable with that, or I need to go to bed, actually. But she's not a burden, and she's never been a burden, and she'll never be a burden no matter how much she thinks she is. People can often be their own worst critics, and the things they think are problems, the people around them likely do not. That thing you're obsessively worried might be the catalyst to destroy your friendships, it's probably not. I think you can draw draw a lot of conclusions about someone based on what they write, but personally, S-pop has never told me anything about Nate other than how Pavloved he's become by weeb shit. Like, if I still thought Revolutionary Girl Utena was good at the age of 30, I'd probably have a bit of a complex too, but I don't buy into the notion that there's such a thing as a Utena to beating your wife for fun pipeline, and I think going to those kind of extremes is unhealthy, dangerous, and borderline slanderous. This was something I deliberately demonstrated in my Steven Universe video. It is possible to draw a line connecting the way Steven Universe is written to fascist sympathy, but it's a lot more reasonable to unpack the way redemption regardless of crime has been shoved down our throats as good writing advice for many years, to the point that people just automatically jump to it without thinking, and maybe we need to talk about that. Just branding a creator with one particular label is the safest thing you can do. You can make the connection, oh, so these are fascists who get sob stories, therefore the creator sympathizes with fascists, but that conveniently ignores all the people in the audience who also thought this was the height of fiction and what that might say about everyone. We were all propagandized to as kids with this shit. Cachadora, for all the showrunner's claims of being a very personal project, isn't even the first time abuse has been used as a precursor to romance. Women have had that idea beaten into their head for hundreds of years. This started with Beauty and the Beast, a story about a woman who is forced into a castle and has to work at making the monster she shares it with into a respectable human being for her own sake. The original folktale was a vector to ease young women into accepting arranged marriages, especially those in the upper classes whose husbands were exactly what you'd expect rich men who have never known consequences in their lives to be. To young women, this was a horrible prospect, and there needed to be a way to assert that it gets better so they wouldn't kill themselves. This trope has been so heavily browbeaten for so fucking long that a lot of people just accept it as normal. The Disney movie Beauty and the Beast is considered a love story for the ages, even though its original story was an errant lie. And given the faulty logic of shitty romance trope but gay, it was only inevitable that this trope would find its way to the LGBT community and dig itself in deep. Culture has been placing the onus on women to be the active force in taking control of men's behavior for all of European history. And it's from this attitude that we get the idea that all a woman needs to change her monstrous partner is a little elbow grease. Trying to make this all about one creator is a means of protecting yourself and avoiding the reality that we've all been propagandized to. We've all been conditioned to accept certain tropes and subtly implement them into our real lives. I've made joking remarks in the past that the violence in S-pop gets so gratuitous it borders on eroticized. Lol, don't check Nate's browser history. But the truth is that violence against women, especially when that violence is committed by other women, is eroticized in pop culture. A lot of people do this shit. A lot of people like this shit. And the fact that we do this shit is so commonly known, old unfunny sitcoms were pointing it out 30 years ago.
Because men think if women are grabbing and clawing at each other, there's a chance they might somehow kiss.
We're all part of this. Trust me, my job would be a lot easier if I sincerely believed you can pin everything on a creepy showrunner, but that only works in an environment where a ton of people weren't showering this damn thing in praise every waking moment it was on screen. This wasn't someone's creepy fanfic that died in the bowels of AO3 right next to the erotic Screwfly Solution fanfiction. This was a public work that still, to this day, is showered in praise and held up as the gold standard of gay romance. And I feel that attempts to psychoanalyze Stevenson on a level deeper than, wow, your browser history must be fucked up, feels like a way of protecting yourself. As I said a decade ago, the audience deserves just as much of a scrutinizing eye, and things like this are just ways to avoid doing that. The truth is that this trope has been browbeaten into our heads for a very long time. A trope that started with a lie designed to keep women from taking the easy way out of a life of being treated like property to self-entitled men. None of us are immune to propaganda.